This is me. I'm Dave Gray, Principal Lecturer in Economics, not Economic Portfolio Planner, as was suggested earlier, because we don't know what that means. Oh, work. B. All right, so what are we going to talk about? In principle, we're going to look at tenure structure, but mostly about owning. There'll be points about renting. There are two types of owning, two types of renting. Outright owning, on owning with a mortgage. You can rent either in the private sector, you rent in the private sector, the social sector, or local authority renting. Your tenure choice could be down to you can choose what your tenure is, but sometimes, well, for most people, their choice is constrained by possibly their age and possibly their income. Life cycle. A lot of this stuff is going to be... You're coming in?
Yes, there's some people who've been in the other lecture theatre, they're just coming.
Right, let's continue. Life cycle. We can use a life cycle in terms of age and moving. There's no consensus about the path of a housing career, but you can view it as U-shaped. Same thing as you can apply to income. You can look at a number of variables, which I'll go through in a moment, but there's essentially there's progression up to the third age. Third age is around 50, 55, and then you downsize. Now, I created this, which I hopefully will make sense to some people who are of the third age.
Thank you so
much. B stands for bedroom. So let's say there's a hierarchy of housing quality in terms of ownership. 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom, and 1 bedroom. And I'm going to suggest to you that what we do is, with constrained choice, we flow through something like this, in part related to our wealth and in part related to our family units. As we increase the number of children we have in our families, we move from one house size to another. So one would anticipate at some stage you start off with a small house and you buy a larger one, and eventually you get to the point where you get a 4-bedroom house possibly. After that you might downsize to something possibly in the city where you move back to 1-bedroom house and you sort of you downsize then. Now, the money flows. In general, people are require some sort of loan to buy their house. LTI and LTV, they're going to feature quite prominently. LTI stands for loan to income and LTV is loan to value. You need, most people needing to borrow money. At least that used to be the case. Now, there's also some flows other than from banks. There'll be inheritances and monies from parents. So the first-time buyer, FTB, is likely to be funded from their own personal savings and from inheritances from their grandparents, say, or monies from their parents. Now, of particular interest is the BTL, which stands for Buy-to-Let Buyer. And the Buy-to-Let Buyer has not got a particularly good reputation, in part because they remove housing from the owning sector and rent it back to those people who could possibly want to buy. There's also those people who have a second home, a holiday home. So one would expect movement in this direction in terms of age and household size. So age is a good indication of where you are in this system. Chances are, if you're around 55, you're in this sort of zone. Hence me. Now, some of these numbers are really quite interesting. Ownership and renting. Ownership with mortgage and outright. And here we have income groups, 1 being the poorest group and 5 being the highest income group. Total 22.7 million people. As you could see, owning outright, more people own their house outright in 15-16 than were owning with a mortgage. And that's changed recently. And we can see that the number of people that rent is slightly higher than the other two groups. But renting is basically something you do if you're relatively poor. So the lowest fifth, 60% rent, of the richest fifth, 16% rent. And here was some data to do with, in 2013, 4 million renting households, just under 1 million were on housing benefit. So chances are if you're renting, there's an association with housing benefit. Housing benefit bill has gone up considerably, which does seem to vex the government. Age of renters. As you can see, there are the numbers to do with age. Over 65, relatively small group. The big group of renters is those between the ages of 25 and 34. How much do renters pay? Savills estimate that renters pay around 54 billion to buy-to-let landlords in the 12 months of 2017. Of this, 20 billion was paid in London, or 24 by younger people. Interest paid on mortgages by OO, stands for owner-occupier, 26.5 billion, and that was down from 2012. But renters paid more over that same period. So increasingly, we're seeing that people are excluded from buying. Council's mortgage lenders found that 65% of households born in 1970 were homeowners by the age of 35. Due to unaffordability, this dropped from 65% to 44% for those born in 1980. Renting is becoming more troublesome. The proportion of your disposable income, it doesn't really matter what region you're looking at. The proportion of your income going on rent is increasing generally. Right, let's have a look at this. Here's another table that's quite interesting. Those living with their parents. In 1996 to 1998, around 2 million people were of adult age but living with their parents. This increased from 1996 to 2014 to 2.7 million. So there's a notable increase in the proportion of people living with mum and dad at the ages of 20 to 34. There's a link between fertility and home ownership. I'll show you a link. Essentially, it's not uncommon for people to buy when they're thinking of starting a family. But increasingly, this is offset by renters. Now, here we have another interesting graph. Average age when males marry females and females marry males. There's another group, but that's quite small. The average age is here. So as we see, from 1990, the average age around 31 when a bloke got married. That is increasing to 37. It's quite interesting how the age gap is consistent over time. Blokes like marrying younger women, and women like marrying older men. Perhaps quite rightly. But we can see that there's a general increase and then a notable increase here. So the financial crisis is changing things. 2008 is a major marker. Average age when a woman has their first child, that's also increasing. So families, household units are starting late and children are coming on later. We're becoming an ageing society. Now this shows when you have your child, your first child, and here's the gap between the first child and the second child and the third child and the fourth. Once you start having children, it gets quicker. On this scale, this is in terms of that one in terms of years, and this one's in terms of months. So it used to be a 14-month gap between your first child and your second child, but you get quicker and quicker. Household structure, structured dwellings. About a quarter of houses are detached. 30% is semi-detached. Large terrace 19.2, small terrace 6.8, and you can see flats and bungalows. So the structure, the question asked earlier, a quarter of households are detached, so a sizable number. Proportion of owned outright passed 50% in 2012, 2013. 78% of those owned outright are either occupied by an individual or a couple without dependent children. The number of lone person households increased from 2.23 million to 7.23 to 7.74 million. So increasingly, people are living in homes on their own. And here we see the breakdown of single person households by age group. So this age group is expanding over time, the over 75s group. So this is the point I made earlier. It's a blockage issue. Essentially, if there's a conveyor belt and people are sitting in 4-bedroom detached, which is what they like doing, then there's not enough space for other people to move along the conveyor belt. Essentially, rich people, they have large houses and they like to be visited by their kids or grandkids. That's why they don't move on. Estimation, there are 2.9 million homes occupied by over 65 with 2 or more extra bedrooms. The exit rate, people leaving those houses at 90,000 a year, is just too low, and that needs boosting, or we need to build more houses, which we are really loath to do. Regional differences. Now, this talk was supposed to be about East Midlands. The East Midlands isn't that interesting a region. It tends to be representative of the UK as a whole. But I'll show you this one. Here we have the regions along the base here. NI, Northern Ireland, East Midlands, Yorkshire, Humberside, East of England, North East, South East, all the way up to London. This is standardised by the average price in the region. So what this says is approximately a 3-bedroom dwelling gives you an idea of the average house price of the area. A 4-bedroom dwelling is 1.5 times that, and a 5-bedroom dwelling is double that. Does that make sense to everyone? So you can see it's approximately the same right across the country. So it's a good indicator of where we are. You can look at house price. This is quite an interesting one in terms of a different way of standardising things. House price per square metre, 2004, 2016. So you can see how house prices moved. And here we can see the crisis around 2007, 2008 brought it down. And then the recovery. In certain regions, we're not really recovering from 2008. But the expensive regions, South East, South West, East of England and London, as you can see, they really have recovered. Now the next table will be rather complex, so I'll dance around. Stock of 14.33 million homeowners, how many of those moved? And we've got some numbers here. Essentially, a sizable number of people moved, but they moved in general within their grouping, whether owning or renting. So we got 191,000 moved from renting to owning, was what you expect. But we've also got some that move from owning to renting, which could come about in part possibly because there's a family breakup. Divorces is one way of creating a sizable number of households. So here's the table, and it's quite complex to take through, but what we see from the Office of National Statistics is this pretty diagram showing how moves occur. But essentially, if I move back, the diagonal, we move between our standard groups. So if you're renting, if you're a private sector renter, you're likely to move to another dwelling where you're still a renter. Any estate agents in the audience? Number of property sales for dwelling types. Now, the 4-bedroom detached is not the most common thing that's sold. From the flows of movement of people, you would expect smaller houses to be in the market more often. As you can see, terrace have the large representation in the housing market at any one time, and flats and maisonettes are small but increasing. What is important is a general flow upwards until we see this massive drop in the number of dwelling sales. The financial crisis has changed the number of houses that have been, dwellings that are being sold. Now I'll put this in this is not as important for this discussion, but it does say that one of our problems is not only do we not build very many houses, but we have an increasing population. I'll put this one in part because I was interested in Ireland. Ireland's population yo-yos much more than ours does, in part because they are subject to a much higher rate of emigration. That's slide set number 1. Now this is when we start having a look at how house purchases are financed. In general, we'll assume that a high proportion of people, although increasingly a smaller, high proportion of people require to borrow money to buy a house. Now, they're likely to borrow money from a bank or building society, and the bank or building society will face what we call agency costs. They don't know who's a good risk or a poor risk. So what they do is they utilise what we call loan metrics, the LTI and the LTV, loan to income and loan to value are standard measures. They're associated with house HPE, which stands for house price earnings ratio. When I first studied this, I didn't realise how important it is to pay attention to these metrics. Now, this analysis is utilised by these people. Not that important, but we'll assume the repeat buyer, someone who's buying a second house, is credit constrained, and the first-time buyer, the difference between a first-time buyer and a repeat buyer is a first-time buyer doesn't own a house and a repeat buyer does. Both of them need to borrow money. We'll assume the first-time buyer buys a smaller dwelling than the repeat buyer. So what you end up with is a first-time buyer is looking for one property, whereas the repeat buyer has 2 properties on their books, one to buy and one to sell. Now, what's important about this analysis is as house prices rise, the first-time buyer is priced out of the market. But that's not true of the repeat buyer. The repeat buyer is actually better off because the value of their house goes up as house prices rise. And this, to some extent, is a major cause of concern. So, for the economists here, this implies that housing might have an upward sloping demand curve, at least for some portion, which is not what we standardly teach. So, here's some numbers if you want to play with this. Now, here's the numbers. You can fall asleep if you like, but these numbers tell you where we are in terms of housing. Why it's important to be on the housing ladder, and why it's important to perhaps to tax capital gains. Assume a loan to value of 80%. That means the building society will only lend you 80% of the value of a house. Assume the value of the house you want to buy is 100,000, and assume that the loan to income is 4. So if you earn 25,000, which is below average, and you have a £20,000 deposit, the house you could buy at maximum is 100,000. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, if the house price went up by 9%, the house price would go from 100,000 to 109,000. That's nice and simple. But the equity in the house goes up from 20,000 to 29,000. So from just 1 year, from doing no work at all, you're suddenly £9,000 better off. And you can use this as the basis for borrowing more money. So it's possible, using a multiplier of 5, that the year before you could afford a house for 100,000, you can now afford a house for 145,000. Strictly speaking, that's not true because, I don't know why that came out in the wrong order. You move from one metric to another, that's a constraint. But it means you could still buy a house for 129,000, whereas the year before you could only buy a house for 100,000. That's in 1 year, and 9% increase is not that unusual. Now, it's estimated that raising the loan to value from 75% to 85% will mean you can buy a much, much more expensive house. Much, much more. So the system is inherently unstable. Just by a slight increase in house price can mean that first repeat buyers are remarkably better off than they were before. On top of that, there's what's called a financial accelerator. That is, lending's based on risk. How do you reduce your risk? You put it against some collateral. But as the house price rises, a repeat buyer has more collateral, so they can borrow more money. So what happens is, with rising house prices, it appears safer lending, therefore lending is pro-cyclical. So banks inadvertently accelerate the process we've got here. They make the system the system is inherently unstable. So first-time buyers, average loan to value of first-time buyers in 2016 was 84%. Average advance 133,000. There's the loan to value. HHI is household income of £40,000. Now, some of these numbers you look at this, this can't make sense. The percentage of income to service the mortgage is only 17.6%. Average age 30. Now, these numbers are in nominal terms. So on this scale, you've got income, which is the dark line. And on this scale, you've got the loan and the price. There should be a gap because people have to put down a deposit. Notice, you have to be very old to have bought a house around here. 1969 up till, 2008, generally, rocketing increase, and then it stalls. House prices stopped rising the way they were, possibly because of the financial crisis. We see the financial crisis seems to have changed things significantly. Here we have the corresponding numbers for repeat buyers. Average age of repeat buyer, 39. So after 9 years, they move on. Again, the same sort of scale, the same sort of pattern. Something changes around 2008. Number of buyers in the market. Now, what we've said is that as house prices rise, the number of buyers in the repeat buyer is better off and the first-time buyer is worse off. So we should see house prices affecting the number of buyers in the market. Importantly, what's happened recently is an increase in the number of buyers by the increase because of the incident of the BuytoLet Buyer. So here we see a pattern. First-time buyers and repeat buyers generally moving together. One would anticipate this is related to income changes, but also the first-time buyer really panics if they can't get on the housing ladder, so they try and keep up. But here you see a massive gap between the repeat buyer, this one, and the first-time buyer. The first-time buyer is increasingly priced out in the late 1990s, and the gap gets larger until we get to our good friend 2008 and the financial crisis. Right, this you need to pay attention to. In principle, the lending metrics should remain stable. If they become more favourable, this will accelerate house prices. So on this axis, on this pattern, we have the loan to income. Now, loan to income from 1979 has changed dramatically. So banks are becoming more willing to lend people larger and larger amounts of money. Now, I'd have to say, without this lending, there is a problem. Without this lending, the repeat buyer can't sell their house. So the whole system relies on lending getting more and more generous. Oh, sorry, wrong way around, but you end up with the same problem. You see a notable increase from 1979 onwards. A very nice pattern. The buy-to-let buyer. The buy-to-let buyer is a buyer that injects wealth into the system. They buy up houses and then rent them out to those who can't afford to buy. It's a product of financial liberalisation. You can view a house as something you consume, as you can live in it, or you can rent it out. One of the problems with our system is that you can enjoy both. Now, importantly for our discussion, Spriggings and Price review the buy-to-let buyer as a real problem. The buy-to-let buyer occupies the same portion of the market as those who are wanting to buy their house for the first time. So their phrase is the repeat buyer sucks flats out of or small houses out of the market and then rents them back to those people who want to get on the housing ladder. Here we see a pattern of number of type of people in the market. We see a dramatic fall in the repeat buyer and first-time buyer, but a rise in the buy-to-let buyer up until 2008, then that sort of dies out. But they were occupying the same market. You can see that this is the obverse of that. Essentially, these people are possibly pricing out these people from the market. Intergenerational transfers. Another problem area for the housing market is, do you have rich parents or grandparents? Now, these numbers are not unrealistic. If you buy at the age of 25 and you have a child at 30 and you die at 80, I'm planning to die at 88 myself. You've got to have a plan for when you die, because you've got to pass your money on, haven't you? And half the wealth is held by those over 50. Now, if you work on this basis, your income should be at its peak around 55. That's about the same time as you're likely to inherit your house. The 55-year-olds should be remarkably wealthy, and they can pass on their wealth to their children, so they get them on the housing ladder. But this presents a problem for society in that you've got a system whereby those who have parents who own a property are likely to get on the property ladder. Those who haven't got parents or grandparents of the property can't. Increase in number of assisted purchases. September 2016, 2.8 billion of family support was injected into the market. 34% of first-time buyers relied on it in 2013-14. This means you're allowed to, it's possible to buy a house earlier than it would have been otherwise. Unassisted purchases, 2005 to 2011. Dramatic drop. The assisted purchase is about stable. So what we see is becoming more and more difficult for those to buy a house without the help from their parents or grandparents. This list here is related to a different slide, but hadn't got enough room. It costs about £10,000 to buy a house. This is the breakdown on average. As we can see, estate agents will take out around £5,000 of your house purchase. We won't talk about conveyancing surveyors. Right, so cost of buying is on the previous page. How long does it take to sell? I thought I'd throw in a few pieces of information. It takes about 102 days to sell a house in 2008, 6 days longer than in 2018, 6 days longer than 2017. London, for some reason, takes longer. estate agents issue. The average age of the second-time mover is increasing. We're saying it's more difficult for first-time buyers to get on the market, but also people are moving at a later age. And fewer people are moving on. Before 2008, homeowners moved 3.6 times after buying their first property. That's dropped to 1.8. People are not moving. Research done by UK Finance, which is the lobbying body for banking, for retail banks and building societies. There's been a drop in transactions of around 400,000, of which they say 140,000, there are 140,000 missing movers. Possible explanations are awkward. For some, if you look at it, for those who purchased a house in the pre-2008 period, well, certainly from in the 1970s and 80s, they experienced relatively high interest rates, but also relatively high inflation. Now, house prices used to be a very good hedge against inflation, but with inflation, it eats away at the real value of your debt. We don't see that anymore. So what we're missing is the equity growth. Boo, hiss, hiss. One of the big losers in the system, therefore, are estate agents. They don't see the trade. And a report that came out a few weeks ago is that 27% of estate agents are struggling to survive. Now, it's not helped by Purple Bricks, but then Purple Bricks are in trouble as well, aren't they? Yeah, Chief Executive left. That's slide second set. Right, last set. I'm now going to talk about cycles, which is not to plug my book at all. Business cycles. You would anticipate there are cycles in housing because there are cycles in general. There's a business cycle of around possibly 7.5, 8 years, and you can see this if you do some work on house prices. So the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyor found a cycle in housing of around 8 years with possibly 2 others. Alexander Barrow finds something similar between 5 and 10, and Rosenthal between 6 and 8. Gray, that's me, find one in what you find in Ireland's house prices around 6.4 years. Right, business cycle, no problem. Income rises and falls in a cycle. Telephone. Now, what might have been missed or called medium, as it could be medium-term cycles. Now, a couple of guys have seemed to identify cycles of around 14 years. And these medium cycles are associated with finance or credit. Now, is it possible there are 2 sets of cycles that interact? I'm going to claim there is. One related to one element of the normal rationing, the loan to income, and the other one is to do with the finance or credit. Hiram Minsky. Financial cycles. How important are financial cycles? He talks about basic and super cycles. Essentially, this says we're not to be trusted. We are too optimistic about the future. Agents become progressively optimistic about the future, and they're willing to take more risk with asset prices. When this happens, the banks and building societies become more willing to lend people larger amounts of money. The optimism of both borrowers and lenders is reinforcing. So these are the 3 stages, and I've got some cuttings here showing that where we might be. Standard model, you'd expect you take out a loan, and the building society would expect you to pay the interest and the capital. No problem there. Second stage, lenders start thinking, well, perhaps that's a bit harsh. We'll let you make the interest payments only. The interest-only mortgage, nod wisely. Stage 3, we can't make the interest payments. That's called a Minsky point. This means progressively we end up lending far too much money to individuals. We end up with a financial crisis. So what do is we change the regulation. Now what Minsky says with the super cycle is there's erosion of structures and institutions that moderate lending. After a big bust, regulators put in rules to stop us lending too much money to people who can't afford to pay. These are subsequently eroded. Now this is where you've got to nod and think this is what Donald Trump is doing with Dodd-Frank. He's progressively reducing that so where institutions can lend more money. Now Lima, who's an expert in housing in the United States, adopts this for the housing market. So broadly you should be able to see this fits in with what we've been discussing. A relaxation of the loan to value and the loan to income metrics. The patterns I've showed you, we are willing to lend people more money for their given level of income. For those who are around in 2008, do you remember Northern Rock with a 125% mortgage? Now that is really taking risk. Northern Rock went down though, didn't it? The self-certified mortgage where you could just lie about how much you earned. That was literally, you could lie how much you earned. So you could how are we doing for time?
Just goes for 5 minutes, 7 minutes.
15 minutes, okay.
Okay.
I'll quickly run through this. This is for the oldies. Bank regulation has gone through phases. Up until the early 80s, there was rationing. There was a building society cartel. When I was born, almost to the day, my parents rushed out and took out a building society account for me. Why? Because building societies rationed what they lent and you had to be a long-term member. That changed. We had a run up to 1990 big bang and a liberalisation of credit. What happened? I'll show you in a minute. There was a crash. The crash occurred around 1989. After that we had a major problem in the South East of England where lots of people were in negative equity. The economy slowed. Up until 2008, which occurred where we had the second great crash, again we had a deregulation of the market, the rise of the mortgage equity release and buy-to-let, but particularly lax lending practices. The ninja loan in the United States being a classic case. Medium-term cycles. What are these? The Bank of International Settlement is concerned about medium cycles. These are financial cycles which you can spot if you filter out some of the data. Haldane is one of the works of the Bank of England, but these three guys identify a credit cycle of around 13 years in a long series of data, 130 years. So, this is where we get to the interesting bit. Filtering house prices. I'm going to assume the following. A trend is anything that lasts longer, is a cycle that lasts anything longer than 20 years. We can come to that. A business cycle of around 2 to 8 years, and a financial cycle is the gap. Anything less than 2 years, I'll just say is random or erratics. Here we see the UK. This is in log form, but in general, we see rising house prices, and then we get to 2008 and things plateau. Wrapped around that is this. A cycle. That filters out anything less than 20 years. I hope you can spot that there are clearly some peaks in the cycle. Here, here, and here. This one I don't know very much about. Doesn't make sense. There should be a spike here for anyone who's good for the oldies. The Barber boom for 1973. This one occurs around 1979. Here's the big crash in 1998. And here's the one we keep talking about, the financial crisis. What's wrong with the financial crisis is the peak occurs at the wrong time. That peak there occurs in 2004. That's 2007, that's 2008. So So the peak occurs at the wrong time. The market was already in decline before we talk about the crash. But clearly you can see cycles. At least I think so. Here we see London, broadly the same pattern. Here we see Northern Ireland. The reason I'm showing you Northern Ireland is something's missing. That hasn't got the same crisis in 1989. But the interesting thing about Northern Ireland is this. It has a boom and bust, which is a lot larger than anywhere else in the UK or Ireland or anyone else. But no one knows about this. It's almost... Did anyone come across this? Northern Ireland has the most enormous bubble. Lasted for 2 years. And here we have East Midlands. As I say, East Midlands is representative of the rest of the UK. We're coming to the end. Now, what I've done is I've filtered out bits of the price cycle into 3. We have this black one, which is shows cycles between 2 years and 8 years long. We'll call these business cycles. The full range, filtering out the erratics, is the 2 to 20 year cycle. And the bit in between we'll call the financial cycle. So you have to look at the gap between that one and the orange one. And as you can see, tiny gap there. This, I'm suggesting, is almost entirely a financial cycle problem. People had too much money, house prices were driven up, not very much related to income. In 1989, you can see that there's if you combine these two, about half the gap can be explained by the financial cycle, half by the income cycle. And this one is mostly to do with income. But the financial problem we see, the housing crisis we see in 2004, 2007 is different to this one. This one actually, the 1989 one, is much larger. Also I'd like to draw your attention to is this bit. London. London, you can see that's the gap between the business cycle is almost unimportant apart from here. It's driven by finance. And in Northern Ireland, partly finance, partly by income, but you see the financial cycle almost non-existent until you got to the financial crisis. So we've got a problem with too much money chasing our property, and we're on the upswing, big time. So here's UK. Clearly, 2 peaks, 2004, 2007 there. If anyone's going to ask me a question, can you spot the ripple effect? Yes, you can spot the ripple effect in these medium-term cycles. London peaks before, East Midlands peaks before the North. So the ripple effect you can see in medium cycles, you can't see it in business cycles. Almost there. This you can download and play with yourself. These come from the Nationwide Building Society. This is the house price earnings ratio for first-time buyers. Historical mean around 3.5. We use this as an indicator of how reckless lending is. As you can see, in the peak around 1989, we got up to just under 6. Most recent one, peak here, we see, by the way, this should be London. Peak around London in 2007, around 7. Look at where we are now. Well, the same problem with all the other regions. Historically, we're way above where we used to be. Way above. Northern Ireland, here we see lending too much, complete crash. The house prices are still lower than they were in 2008. I think we're on the last slide. Last slide, one. Okay. Can house prices continue to deviate from incomes? Well, yes, they can. Surprisingly enough, financial innovation is still with us. The mortgage age limit has been raised by the Halifax and Nationwide to somewhere in the 80s, 15 years after they retire. What are they? How do they pay for this? And so the average mortgage length, when I took out my mortgage, I assumed the average length of mortgage is 25 years. That has drifted up now. Almost half of mortgages are now longer, up to 30 years. We see crises in other areas. I thought this was quite entertaining. This came out last week. The guy featured in The Big Short is shorting against house prices in Canada. In Australia, they are ludicrously high, and there are other parts of the world where they're still. The problem is there is too much money floating around due to quantitative easing. Last thing I'll say, these two more cuttings. Here we have Nationwide to offer 55-year-olds greater mortgage options. Essentially, here we're looking at interest-only loans to those over 55 who've retired. And then on this one, we see interest rate only commercial loans sparks fears of crisis era loose lending. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're about to feature we're about to see another financial crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think you talk about 53 minutes, some more than. So now it's your time. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and then David's going to ask you questions.
Does your 2004, 2008 ski jump anomaly have anything to do with the increasing amount of derivatives that were in the marketplace around mortgages at that time, and the fact that they were more easily tradable than the mortgages themselves?
That should have made matters worse, shouldn't it, rather than better? House prices should. The panic occurs. People stop buying houses when they think they can't sell them. If you get into trouble, you can sell them. So if the market becomes less liquid, they're less likely to buy. But derivatives would imply you're more willing to buy, if I understand your question.
Just that within there, I'm not sure I've formed the idea fully yet, but it was the first time, it was the first crisis really that derivatives were playing a really significant part in the mortgage market around the world. And I just wondered if there was some early selling.
Right. This is economic history time.
Which, a typical wave 5 on Elliott wave theory.
Derivatives stopped working around August the 7th, 2007.
Yeah.
That's when the mortgage really dried up, the market dried up. That's when 2 CDOs failed.
But there was amongst the what should we say, certain sections of the expert market, there were indications much earlier.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why I'm saying, was that 2004 an indication of experts?
And bailing out beforehand.
Yes, bailing
I couldn't say. In my subject, if you know something is going to go wrong, if you know house prices are going to collapse, you don't buy. But Goldman Sachs buys because they are smarter than everyone else and they sell before the crash. So it could be they bailed out earlier, possibly. But I couldn't say.
Quantitative easing wasn't an issue, was it before 2007, 2008? So it doesn't explain what happened in the late 90s.
Ah, okay.
But money was getting cheaper, wasn't it?
It's called the Great Moderation. Not only do we have deregulation where it makes it easier to lend people more money, but also Southeast Asian countries save prodigiously. And where does this money go? But it sort of sloshes around the rest of the world. So this drove house prices. This drove interest rates down, and made it appear as if a large number of central bankers were knowing how to manage their economy because they found it quite cheap to borrow money. So this occurred progressively with the cheap money around, as the amount of savings around the world was keeping interest rates down. Way before.
Yeah, with regard to your UK data in particular, how much of the lending and borrowing that you might call exuberant is actually attributable to the historically extended low bank rate? And to what extent is that going to be a factor in the anticipated process that you seem to suggest?
A sizable proportion of loans were interest only in the run-up to 2008. If interest rates rise now, those people who can just meet the interest payments are going to have to sell. That will precipitate another crisis. So I would argue one of the reasons we don't increase our interest rates now is in part the panic over that will ensue. So there is a notable throwback to what went on in 2007 and before.
Which presumably Haldane is well aware of what he's sitting in the banking system.
Yes.
When you say financial crisis is coming, do you really mean that the house prices are about to drop?
I look at this and I think, by historical standards, prices are a lot higher than they would be relative to incomes. If people can't afford to pay for their housing, then there will be a crisis.
In one of those slides, I can't remember, but when you show the cycles, I can see that the house price continues to rise over time.
Yes, that's because historically we had the loan to income scale seems to be rising considerably over a long period of time. Banks seem to be lending more and more money out to people for a given level of income. And that lending has to be, the interest payments have to be made, the principal has to be repaid. How can you do it? If your income isn't rising very much, but your borrowing is, eventually there will be a crisis.
Mm-hmm. So between housing market and financial market, do you think they co-move, or they could be the substitution for each other in terms of investment?
They're both funded by cheap money.
So they are both assessed markets?
Yes.
Okay.
How do we fix this? Or is it not? Is it just inevitable? I don't want to be in this situation.
Well, for a first-time buyer, the key problem is house prices are ludicrously high. You have to find some way of, don't want to be harsh here, but encourage your parents and grandparents to give you shed loads of money. I know my kids are very keen on that. One of the reasons we are where we are is we don't tax capital gains. So a house can be viewed as an asset as well as somewhere where you live. If we tax capital gains considerably on your first property, I think some of these problems will go away. But it's difficult to move us back to the best time to buy, I would suggest, would be about 1996. It's got worse ever since then. Curiously, that's when I bought my house. But they become, what we went through, it's through deregulation, we went through a regulated system whereby it was difficult to borrow money, but house prices were low, and so it restricted access to a large number of people. We've gone to an unregulated system where house prices are high, and broadly it means that we still restrict access to housing. It's just possibly a different group is now excluded. Essentially, if you're poor, you can't get on the housing ladder, whereas before, in 1996, it was perfectly possible with quite a modest income, assuming the building society could lend you money. How we get back there? You've got to ask an entire generation to give up an awful lot of wealth. So it's very unlikely.
Are you potentially saying that we need a crash to realign the earnings back to the actual values to get people back onto the market? Because wouldn't a crash potentially support that, getting first-time buyers back onto the market?
First-time buyers need house prices to be lower. How you get there is up to you.
So
We're not going to raise incomes, we need to lower prices. Buy-to-let is, Help to Buy just makes matters worse. Doesn't make it better, it just gives a small group of people more money to buy houses, which will push up house prices, which makes it less affordable for everyone else.
That increases social housing then?
Building lots of houses. That would be a terrific idea. We've been saying that for 20, 30, 40 years. There must be some impediment that stops us from doing that. And I don't want to be harsh here about old people, but the biggest losers from house prices being driven down are old people. There's a vested interest in not lowering prices. Not wishing to be harsh there. But we don't build enough houses. Then we get reports on a periodic basis saying we need to build X number of houses, and we always fail to achieve that. Although I would point out that in Ireland they built far more houses than they could possibly need, and they still ended up with a housing crisis.
What about financial institutions? So there are many smart people in financial, like banks. Are they not able to see this down prices?
Well, you've got two models. Either they are foolish or they're not. Well, you'd have to assume they are, because they were the biggest losers. If you can't make your mortgage payment, you'd have a problem, but if you renege on your loan, the bank has a problem. It shouldn't be in banks' interest to lend money to people who can't repay, because the default means they will have to pick up the tab. If they're working on the basis that the debt will be socialised, then we have a problem, which possibly they did do.
I think it's also about regulations. So the banks, they know how to just turn around the regulations, and they know that at the end of the day, the government will help them to just take them out from that crisis, as we see in South.
Regulations are subsequently eroded. That's it. You put in regulations. Regulations were brought in 2015 about lending metrics. Within a few years, someone will say, "Oh no, we're much more responsible than we were then. Let's make those restrictions more liberal." That's what happens. Financial innovation.
Is that a political decision or a regulatory decision, do you think?
Donald Trump is attacking the Fed for not lowering interest rates. His regulator is supposed to be independent, but he's making it difficult. Same thing is happening in India.
Isn't there another factor about your loan to income rising, which is that you say that incomes aren't going to rise. If there's all these tales coming in about the impact of artificial intelligence on jobs, and particularly affecting the jobs of people who are in the mortgage market and their employability and whether those jobs are going to exist, which could not only
I'll answer your question in a different way. The housing market is likely to be severely undermined in the near future over student loans. Is a bank going to lend someone an enormously large amount of money if they're already in debt up to 60,000 quid? We don't know yet.
Are banks actually going to consider those as loans or as merely a tax?
And they still have to come out of income.
Yeah.
But the point you're making about a sizable number of people, it's 10.4 million people out of 33 million people not having a job. Yes, our system is geared around one of the people buying a house having an income.
Can I just ask you, in terms of what you just said, does Brexit have anything, whether you stay in the EU or leave the EU, is that going to make any difference to what you said?
The biggest loser, I would guess, would be London. Another twist in this tale about quantitative easing is that housing is an asset. So you can invest for a return. You can buy a flat, and you don't have to rent it out. You just know that the value of the flat will go up, which you're finding increasingly in London. The same applies to Dublin or New York. So it could be that the one that's most exposed to Brexit, London, will be okay because there's still a huge amount of money slushing around looking for somewhere to invest. So house prices in London may be relatively high for a considerable period of time, not because of Brexit, but because there's an awful lot of cheap money out there. If there is going to be a Brexit.
I found it interesting when you talked about the comparison between loan-to-values in buy-to-let mortgages and between first-time buyers. So from my perception of it, the first-time buyer like taking the price out of the market, whereas the buy-to-let buyers seem to be more encouraged. So lenders in terms of loan-to-value seem to be going upwards, and it's kind of suffocating that market. Government regulation over the last couple of years, look at Osborne's kind of tax changes, Section 21 being scrapped over the last couple of months, seems to be pushing government-wise buy-to-let lenders away and trying to return it back to the renters who they're taking out of the market. But obviously, it's being incentivised by the banks with their increased loan values and all that kind of stuff. How do you see that playing out based on
my understanding is the government wants to squeeze out the small landlord. So this should have a notable effect on those people who like watching daytime television and buying a flat up and doing it up because it seems good on telly. The changes in the tax advantages, the buy-to-let change. So I would anticipate there's a decline in the buy-to-let market.
Do you think that'll be taken up by first-time buyers?
The logic is yes, but the housing is remarkably expensive at the moment. If you've got to find a £30,000–40,000 deposit, you're basically in a very difficult situation unless someone's going to give you a shed loads of money. So I would hope things would improve for the first-time buyer, but I'm quite sceptical. I think we're in a mess.
When you were at the ABS side of your first slide, when you were showing different types of houses, 4-bedroom, 5-bedroom, and the rest, and you said for those over 55 who are alone or who are retired, seems to be sitting on those houses and not allowing first-time buyers to get up to the ladder. My question is, with social service, because sometimes most of these people who are sitting, they're single person, but sitting on this 4-bedroom, 3-bedroom house, are sort of insuring for their future, especially for social service provision when they get to a time where they can no longer care for themselves.
Yep.
What would be your advice in terms of how they can probably dispose of this property and save it all, but the interest on saving equate to the value of the property as at the time they will
Are you asking me a question about trying to avoid paying tax there? I'll answer the question in a different way. The system used to work with rates. Essentially, if you were in a large house, you paid a much higher tax to live in that house, which would encourage people to move from larger houses to smaller houses. They'd only live in a larger house if they really needed a larger house. We changed that. We went back to it. Perhaps things might be better for the first-time buyer. Well, the four-bedroom owner needs to move out so that the three-bedroom owner who wants a larger house can move up and vacate for the two-bedroom buyer who can vacate for the one-bedroom buyer. The conveyor belt is, I would argue, blocked by the four-bedroom detached owner, like my good self, who has no intention of moving.
Well, do you think that has, because the most important thing for most of those in the four-bedroom house, not only about the tax, but some of them are seeing it as a way for providing for their care when they retire. Because what they are banking on is the equity on the property.
Yep. Yeah. I agree.
Any other question? So I hope you enjoyed the talk. So in the future we will have more talks about economics. I know we have the leaders and experts in the field. So we plan to have 3 talks in a year hopefully. So if you have any suggestions about the topics, so let us know. We can discuss the topics, and then if you have a demand about specific topics, you can find experts on this topic as well. So thank you for coming.